Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, your ticket to all things college football. Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? Join us as we talk college football from the national championship to college rivalries to bowl games to the Heisman Trophy to which conference is the best. We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between.
Thanks for tuning in to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Jessica Kofi. Now, for the last couple of weeks, a lot of us have been at home and are trying to fill that hole where sports used to be. But luckily for a lot of football fans, the college football season has been unaffected so far, and there's a few more months to determine how that'll play out, if anything will need to be changed. But on the bright side, the NFL season has kicked off as normal with few adjustments here and there. And the NFL draft is still expected to take place between April 23rd and 25th next month. So there's a lot to look forward to as far as football is concerned. And now there's plenty of time to take closer looks at the prospects and anticipate where they might end up and what football might look like next year. And last episode, we started this series by taking a look at some of the other wide receivers in this historically deep class. This 2020 group has the chance to be the deepest in modern history. It's already being called that. And there's a potential for a lot of players at the position to become good producers in the league. So with this highly anticipated 2020 class, we're going to finish off last episode by continuing to take a deep dive into the wide receivers. And this time, we're going to start with somebody who hasn't really been on the top of a lot of teams' radars for the entire offseason, but are now trying to make a name for themselves in a brighter light after getting a little more of the spotlight and a little more of the attention. And that player is Laviska Shenault Jr. out of Colorado. And he is a player that is big and strong, has a fluid movement when it comes to catching and getting the ball in his hands. He just turns into like a brute force bully because he's essentially built like a running back at 230 pounds, but also has the skills of a wide receiver. So his 6'1" frame, when you see a guy of that size, is mostly muscle. And you can tell that by the way obviously when you look at him, but also by the way he runs after the catch, because he has so much control, especially when he breaks out into the middle of the field, that he's willing to take any hit that's coming at him from DBs. And that's the kind of durability you'd like to see in a wide receiver who is going to get pounded a lot and is going to be taking a lot of force. So luckily for Shenault, he was able to prove that that's where his skill set mainly will come in handy for a lot of NFL teams. And even looking back at his career at Colorado, he averaged over 13 yards per catch, which is great, and 4 touchdowns within 11 games in the last season. So he wasn't even just able to contribute as a wide receiver. He also was spread out a little bit more along the offense and even had a little bit of a rushing role, going for 23 rushes for 2 scores and 161 yards, which isn't surprising thinking about how he's built. That's really a good way, one good way for teams to use him even at the next level. and he can become a really crafty player if he needs to be. And not only that, but he was also used on special teams at one point and ran a kick return back for 54 yards. So he really was able to just burst out onto the national scene as a sophomore when he topped 1,000 receiving yards and 6 touchdowns within just 9 games and ranked 4th in the country in receiving yards per game, also adding 5 touchdowns on the ground onto that. And that made him the only player in the nation to reach the level of having 5 touchdowns and 5 rushing touchdowns and 5 receiving touchdowns. So he really does come across as this versatile big force that really should be offensive coordinators' creative dream if they're willing to think of different and unique ways to use him, which isn't really out of the question when it comes to modern football and the direction that the NFL is going. So it'll be interesting to see how exactly he's able to transition those skills to the pros. But that brings us to his combine performance and the fact that that performance really helps him to get to where he is on a lot of mock draft boards right now. Not only did he show up 7 pounds heavier than he was listed to the combine, he showed up at 227, but he also ran a little bit of a off-putting 40-yard dash, only coming out at 4.58 seconds. But it was also revealed that he was dealing with a core muscle injury, and whether or not that affected his time is really up in the air and is really up for debate between teams now. And that's where a lot of the question marks start, honestly, with him, because his play speed on tape, when you watch him play in college, definitely looks faster than the 40-yard dash time that he gave. But knowing the setup of the combine and knowing that they're not in full equipment, they're not wearing pads, there's a lot of downtime in between events sometimes, so the body can cool off. And the fact that now it's been revealed that he was dealing with a core injury, all of those things can kind of factor into his performance at the combine and kind of put a question mark around whether or not the less than stellar times and the less than stellar performances in some areas really were representative of how he can play and what he can do. So it's, by extension, that can even go back into his college career. And when you look at the way that he played this past year, he kind of took a little bit of a slide back from his season in 2018. Last year, he didn't have a single game. Last year, he had 6 games with fewer than 5 receptions. And the year before, he didn't do that one single time, even though he played in 2 more games in 2019 than he did in 2018. And between those seasons, he still ended up with over 200 fewer yards and 5 fewer touchdowns than in his breakout sophomore season back in 2018. So those are things that are being factored in when teams are assessing Shenault and are kind of looking at him and his potential. But at the same time, those are intangibles that you always can't measure because of factoring in injury and because of factoring in combine performances and the things that can affect those outcomes. So there's a lot of question marks for Shenault for sure, but he's definitely getting the benefit of the doubt, and a lot of teams are leaning more favorably towards him because he's the type of player that can fit into any offense, essentially. You just have to have a coordinator that's willing to scheme a little bit and get him touches in a way that really benefits him, because he's a jack-of-all-trades kind of player, and he filled that role for Colorado in his undergrad, where he really showcased his ability to be a runner and a receiver. So he's kind of like a young Percy Harvin in that way. And what that really means is that if whatever team drafts him is going to have to find a way to create mismatches for him based off of the opponent, because that's where he really excels, and that's where he's really able to get into his skill set and outdupe the opposing defenses. So he can attack defenses on a design run or a quick hitter over the middle down the field where he'll definitely be able to break through a lot of tackles and gain a lot of yards after the catch, or in jet sweeps. So even though there's a lot of question marks and concerns surrounding his health, which there should be, and whether or not his skill set that they saw in college at Colorado will translate to the next level, which is also a really valid question. With the right fit, Shenault really could be a breakout NFL receiver. Although that might not happen right away because he's not the type of player that's a lock to be placed in an offense and produce right off the bat. But he does have he isn't a high aspect, but he isn't a high upside prospect. And he's oozing a lot of possibility, but he has to be placed in this kind of system that is going to benefit him. And because of his need to be schemed, he could easily get lost in an offensive shuffle or fall down a depth chart if he's drafted and expected to do things outside of his skill set or expected to develop his different skills faster than he's shown that he can. So a team like the Bills, who don't mind dialing up plays and have a big arm quarterback receiver like Josh Allen, and an athletic quarterback in Josh Allen, or the Saints with head coach Sean Payton, who is always able to dream up something completely new for his offense, or somebody like the Broncos or the Ravens or the Texans, could all be good fits and good environments for Shenault Jr. And speaking of the teams where he would make a good fit, that brings us to our first break. But when we come back, we're going to talk about more teams that are desperately in need of a wide receiver.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines, they got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we talked about Laviska Shenault Jr. out of Colorado and how he's a unique prospect that can be an interesting fit for certain teams that are looking for a wide receiver early in this year's draft. Now, in this segment, we're going to take a look at a couple more of those teams that can be looking to fill their wideout needs. And the first team that we're going to talk about is none other than the New Orleans Saints. And their roster, of course, year after year looks about as good as any other on paper. So saying that they have areas of need might be a little misleading for the Saints because they really are a rock-solid team all around. But they could take the best player available when they're on the clock this year, and it would be hard to argue against that. But if there was an area of need that you'd have to designate for the New Orleans Saints, it would be at this point wide receiver. Because they've already taken care of the number one lingering question after they re-signed quarterback Drew Brees to a 2-year extension. So now that the question of whether or not they're going to be looking for an immediate replacement for Drew Brees is out of the picture, they're trying to find a number 2 receiver to make the most of his next run. Because they have time to find whoever's going to come out behind Drew Brees and take over this franchise once he decides to retire, but that's probably not going to come in this draft. What needs to be the focus in this draft is getting a star on the roster behind Michael Thomas. And you can't say enough good things about Michael Thomas. Michael Thomas is awesome. He's one of the best wide receivers, not just in the game, but probably in history of the NFL. And he's put up some of the best seasons in the last couple of years that we've ever seen, hauling in NFL records for passes, yards, and touchdowns over the last season. Brought in 149 passes for over 1,700 yards and put up almost a double digit in touchdowns, with falling short by just one and having 9. So as his Twitter @name suggests, you really can't guard Mike. And they could make it things easier for him because he is such a stud on the field. All of the defense's attention is always on Mike Thomas. And despite him having such heavy coverage and being so intensely at the center of this offense, he's still able to put up the kind of numbers that he does. And New Orleans is still an extremely successful offensive juggernaut in the NFL. So only imagine if they were able to get a wide receiver out of this year's class who has the potential to be legendary, to be a good producer in the NFL. And if they add that opposite Michael Thomas, that is just, it'll just be unbelievable to see what they could be capable of at that point. And right now they have Ted Ginn Jr. and Traquan Smith, and they're just 2 out of 15 wide receivers with 250 or more routes run, but less than 1 yard per route run. So that's definitely not an ideal situation for any team, let alone a team that is trying to make a deep playoff run and hopefully a Super Bowl run for their aging quarterback. And improving that situation would go a long way towards making their offense a lot more secure, and especially if they were able to secure a deep downfield threat who can make defenses pay a lot more attention to him than just Michael Thomas. And there are a couple players in this draft that would be able to fill that role for the New Orleans Saints, Laviska Shenault Jr. being one of them that was mentioned because he would fit in so well with the designed offense, the way Sean Payton designs his offense. And it would just be an interesting place for him to develop because he might need to put in more production in his first season than looks like would be comfortable for him. But on a team like the Saints, where he has a great training and coaching staff around him, and he has veteran players that are for sure going to be focused on improving the game and improving their team this year, that could be just the perfect landing spot for him. And the next team that is really looking to add to their receiving core is the Minnesota Vikings, who felt comfortable enough with quarterback Kirk Cousins last season and his production to give him another 2-year extension this offseason. But unfortunately for the Vikings, they also traded away Stephon Diggs to the Buffalo Bills. So that leaves a large hole for them on the perimeter of their offense. And that puts a bulk of the responsibility on wide receiver Adam Thielen, who has broken out in the last couple of years and become a bona fide star for the Vikings. But he has a long injury history now, and the Vikings are surely going to want some support behind him if they have to go forward and get even deeper into the playoffs than they did last season. The Vikings have also lacked a lot of production at the tight end position in the last few years, even though they do still have Kyle Rudolph on their roster. He hasn't been as much of an impact tight end as he used to be for the Vikings in the past. So they have a lot of question marks on the offense, and they have a few question marks at quarterback, even though they are solidly going forward at that position. But if they want their offense to improve and not be as running back heavy as it had to be by the end of last season, then they're going to seriously need to look into putting weapons around Kirk Cousins. And that is unlikely to come in free agency with this free agency class. And looking at the draft class, they would be better served to take a young wide receiver who can mature under other veteran players and hopefully join a team that's pretty much built to make another Super Bowl run, or at least another deep playoff run. And that brings us to the San Francisco 49ers, who are in a really good position to build around Jimmy Garoppolo and make another run at a Super Bowl after decisively not going after Tom Brady in free agency, like was kind of rumored to happen. But now that they are for sure going forward with the quarterback that they selected for the next season, they're going to have to place some weapons around him because they lost a wide receiver like Emmanuel Sanders to the Saints in free agency. And he was a big part of their offense after they traded for him from the Denver Broncos last season. But he wasn't exactly performing the way they expected, and that has some to do with injuries as well. Not totally about talent, but now they need to focus on filling that talent and bringing up the receiver core level to the level that their defense is at or the level that their offensive line is at, because San Francisco is also another stacked team that really just has one or two pieces to slide into place before they're a complete team, which is really not knocking them too much because they are recently a Super Bowl team and they look like they're going to be an NFC superpower for a long time coming. And looking at last season's production, they can turn to Deebo Samuel, and he has proven to be a reliable and legitimate option after he emerged down the stretch last season and going into the playoffs. But they don't really have another established option that at this point, and they need more help on the outside, and they need a reliable player to be able to help on the outside, and one that's not going to be plagued by injuries, even though those are unpredictable. But looking at the way they're set up in this draft with 2 first-round picks, they have a chance to get a really nice receiver in this draft, and one that'll hopefully help build chemistry within their offense for years to come. And if that's the case, if we see San Francisco really be able to shore up their roster and make sure that there are no holes left at any position, we could be looking at another dynasty in the making. And the sky is the limit for the 49ers and for a lot of teams right now that are looking for wide receivers, because they are really, for a lot of teams, the last piece that's missing to a more complete-looking team. So they have plenty of chances in this draft to get one of the higher-rated wide receivers off of the board, and it just comes down to who's still available by the time they're picking. And it'll be really fun to watch, no matter who they choose, the products that will hit the field next season. And that's really something to look forward to. Now we're going to take another break, but when we get back, we're going to jump into another player who has risen his draft stock over the last couple of months.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, before the break, we took a look at a few of the teams that will be looking for a wide receiver come this April's draft. And now in this segment, we're going to look at one of the players that could hear their name called particularly early, and that's Brandon Ayuk out of Arizona State. And it's a little surprising to have Brandon Ayuk's name this high on the prospect list because he really started from the ultimate bottom as far as playing collegiate football goes. And no receiver has improved his stock more this season and this offseason than Brandon Ayuk has. And he started his journey in junior college. He transferred to Arizona State in the spring of 2018 before he started impressing as a receiver in his 2 seasons at ASU. And he flashed plenty of returnability while he was there as well. So he was able to catch 65 balls last season for almost 1,200 yards, which averages out to about 18 yards per catch, which is really incredible, especially for a player that transferred midway through his college career. He added on 8 touchdowns and did it all within 12 games. Plus 14 kick returns for 466 total yards, 14 punt returns for 226 total yards, and a return touchdown, while averaging 16 yards per punt return. So he ended up being ranked amongst all FBS players at number 3 when it came to yards per punt return last season, and he was 5th nationally in kick returns, with an average of 32 yards per return. So he was able to put up a lot of production in a short amount of time and do it as a guy who nobody was really looking at or checking for. And he really had challenges to face once he got to Arizona State, because even though he was able to transfer and make the squad, he still had to sit behind N'Keal Harry in the passing attack in 2018. N'Keal Harry has now been drafted by the New England Patriots, as we know. And once Ayuk really got his chance to move up in the spotlight at Arizona State, he exploded onto the scene. And now he was their primary target, essentially. And he's nothing like Harry as a player, which is interesting enough that their offense works so well under Herm Edwards with 2 different types of number 1 receivers. But Ayuk comes off as more of a silky, smooth player with really exceptional after-the-catch moves. And he's really able to clear space for himself and add yards after the catch. And he is a little reminiscent to how dominant Sammy Watkins was at Clemson as well, even though Sammy Watkins might not be today's greatest example, because he kind of proved that being picked at number 4 back in 2014 was a reach, but that doesn't mean that's going to be the same case for Ayuk. And he gives off similar vibes as the weapon that Sammy Watkins showed himself to be 6 years ago. So he's eager to prove himself as a weapon at wide receiver, and he's gotten a lot of inquiries, as a lot of players do, to switch positions and maybe play defensive back. And that's one of the reasons why he went to Arizona State in the first place, coming out of the JUCO ranks, because he didn't want to be switched to a defensive back. He wanted to keep building his skills as a wide receiver, and he was able to do that. But it's understandable why teams would have wanted him to switch to play a different position. Because of his big playability and how athletic he is, he would make a really good defensive back. But he has plenty of room to grow still as a receiver, even though he's already caught up to the skill level he should be at. There are some parts of his technique that do show where he still needs to grow, and he does struggle in a few areas, like his hands show a little bit of consistency. His ability to catch is a little bit inconsistent. So is his roots running technique and ability, which could play into the fact that he only spent 2 years at Arizona State instead of the full 4, maybe 5. But on top of that, he also struggles to clear press coverage from time to time. He can get stuck at the top of routes when he's being challenged by a defensive back physically, even though he's an athletic player himself. When he's stood up to by another physical player, he can get a little bit overpowered and not be able to break free the way his skill set in the past has shown. So he has to develop a little more technique at the line of scrimmage and within his route running, because that's essential at the next level. That's always going to come into play in the NFL. And for him to be able to really be a mainstay receiver for any team, he's going to have to show that he can make those adjustments so that he's, especially on route running, he's not getting in so much contact when he's trying to be deceptive and sell off a break, for instance. Because in the NFL, that might be called a little tighter. It might be pass interference a lot more often. And that's not something that teams would be able to put up with or want to put up with for a long period of time. So his transition into the next level is going to be crucial, mostly because, like was already mentioned, his hands aren't the most consistent. He is not a natural catcher when the ball gets on top of him really quickly. So he usually works the football to guide it into his frame instead of straight up using his hands. So he is a creative receiver, but at the next level, those holes are going to become a lot more glaring, especially when he gets into contested situations and he isn't able to extend the throwing window and create that separation that we're talking about. So he is often waiting for the football instead of having the ability to go after it and go get it in his college career. So that's one thing that coaches are going to be willing to work with him on once he hits the NFL, but it's going to be on him to be able to adjust to that level and show that he can produce at a pro level. And it shows so far from his resume that he is able to make those adjustments, even though he's only had one real season of meaningful production at the college level. And that might be another thing that teams point out that make him a little bit uneasy to rely on at this stage. But with that said, for a team looking for a true game breaker in terms of after the catch production and a vertical presence, especially up the middle, or a dynamic return guy, he's so versatile and can play all those roles really effectively. He can be that guy. He brings an exciting skill set to the table, and just like Laviska Shenault earlier in the episode, he can be the kind of player that creative offensive coordinators are excited to see, and that offensive-minded coaches are going to be excited to work with because there is so much that he can do. So while some of his skill set could be considered a niche tendency and is going to be more of a bonus than a sure hold on the fundamentals of receiving, he does excel in a lot of areas, and he represents a strong value that can be brought to any franchise, even though he does have some holes to fill as a receiver. So he doesn't come without restrictions. That's been made clear. But his ability to make big plays makes a lot of other things easier to live with because there's still a lot that you can do with him, and there's a lot of production and value that he can bring to a receiving core, especially when it comes to being a number 2 receiver that is serving more of a distraction for a number 1 receiver, like the situation with the New Orleans Saints, or as a receiver that has time to sit on the bench and kind of learn from veterans and kind of build up to the level that shows consistency in the NFL. So he can contribute right away from the slot, absolutely, but he would need some manufactured targets and vertical shots while primarily serving as a return guy while he looks to become a more complete wide receiver. And there are a number of teams that could be looking for that exact kind of guy to fill their roster spot. And when we come back after the break, we're going to focus on a few more teams who are looking for those dynamic wide receivers.
Are you looking for help for your fantasy football team? Check out the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. Get today's best advice on who to start, who to sit, even who you should draft. From sleeper picks to red hot lineups, they got it all covered for you. That's gsmcpodcast.com/fantasy-football-podcast. We'll cover traditional leagues, dynasty, PPR, even IDP leagues. When you need fantasy help, there's just one show to hit up. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 3 segments, we talked about 2 players who could be going high in this year's draft, and 3 teams in need that will be looking to pick up some of these wide receivers. So now in this segment, we're going to take a look at 3 more teams that are definitely going to be on the lookout for the best wide receivers on the board. And the first of these teams is the Baltimore Ravens, which might come up a little bit of a surprise considering how well they did last season. They finished 14-2, but their weaknesses were exposed a little bit when they ran into the Tennessee Titans in the playoffs, surprisingly enough. But on offense, it just went to show that quarterback Lamar Jackson needed another weapon or two to be a completed offense and kind of complement his athletic ability. And that brings us to why they need a wide receiver in this year's draft. Lamar Jackson truly needs a number 1 wide receiver, and preferably one that has a big body and is a specialist on the perimeter, which could allow for Hollywood Brown, their wide receiver draft pick from last year, to kind of play in a number 2 type role, kind of like how Deshaun Jackson does for the Eagles. And on their team, he's kind of more expected right now to be in the number 1 role, but it doesn't look like that is the expectation that they had when they drafted him, because last year Hollywood Brown also needed a little more development to his wide receiver skill set. He's definitely fast, he's definitely a breakout receiver, and he can definitely get downfield, but as far as roots and being able to outshake defenders, he still needs a little of development on that side, and so does his size. So getting a wide receiver that is more ready at this point, or at least can complement Hollywood Brown and complement the skills that Lamar Jackson has been able to show both on the ground and with his arm, and also complement the fact that they have a lot of running backs that they can rely on in a committee, but they do need to diversify that offense in order to have a little more skill up their sleeve and be able to outmaneuver a lot of other teams in a way that they weren't necessarily able to this past year when they ran into the Tennessee Titans and their staunch defense. So they're going to be looking to add to the pass catchers that Lamar Jackson has to throw to, because they definitely do not want to waste his prime or not be able to repeat the success that they had last season and over the last couple of seasons. So on top of that, they do have a few tight ends that have been beneficial to their team, and their team is kind of built that way to have those multiple tight end options. And that's one reason why they weren't necessarily as concerned with receiver last season, because for most teams, tight ends like Mark Andrews and Nick Boyle would be more than enough, with Andrews being primarily the receiving type of tight end and Nick Boyle being a highly versatile run blocker in a tight end. So they have the two ends of tight ends that they needed, but they used to have Hayden Hurst, who they recently dealt to the Atlanta Falcons. So because of their unique, diverse ground game, they need at least 3 good bodies at that position, and they're going to have to look for a replacement for Hayden Hurst as a pass-catching option. And since the theme in this year's drafts, obviously, is depth at wide receiver, they could get away with passing on somebody in the first round that would be a fit, because they could still have their choice of wide receivers on day 2 when it comes to the really big back receivers that weren't really in the spotlight this year round because of the studs at the top of the class. So names that come up for them could include Chase Claypool or Bryan Edwards on the second day, or if they were to take another first-round wide receiver this year, they could grab somebody like Clemson's T. Higgins. But Baltimore has a lot of options, and none of them are really predictable. So the direction they go in here is going to show a lot of how they've been thinking, and will also point to what kind of Ravens team we can expect to see on the turf whenever the season starts. Now, the next team that's really going to be looking to claim a wideout is Washington, and they are a lot more interesting because they are a team that has a few good draft picks in good positions this year, namely the number 2 pick, even though it's already been clear that they're going to take Chase Young at that position, because as a once-in-a-generation type player, you would be foolish at that point, number 2, to not take Chase Young to shore up your defense. But more importantly, on the offensive side, it looks like they're leaning towards keeping last year's draft pick in Dwayne Haskins at quarterback. And now that they have a new head coach in Ron Rivera, who just came up from the Carolina Panthers, they are going to be focusing heavily on upgrading the pass-catching options for Dwayne Haskins as well, just like the Ravens have to do with Lamar Jackson. And if he wants his young pass catcher in Haskins to grow in year 2, he's going to have to give him the talent in order to do it. And that focus is going to be mostly on the supporting cast, even though Washington as a team has tons of holes that need to be filled. But with Chase Young coming early in the draft, that fills a little bit of the defensive holes. So for their next following picks, it would make sense if they took a look at the offensive side, because they really need to find a reliable number 2 wide receiver to play opposite Terry McLaurin, who had a breakout season for them last year after basically everybody on their team got injured and went down at some point, and they were really down to the wire. Even though they were not a playoff team by any means, they had a lot of issues again. But he did break out and show elite level talent, and that's a good start for them. But the problem was that everybody who came after him on the depth chart left a lot to be desired. And the same problem that the Ravens have with having to re-up their tight ends is the same problem that Washington has. And they're going to need to replace their pass-catching tight ends like Jordan Reed and Vernon Davis, who recently retired. Reed, who was recently released. So they added Logan Thomas not too long ago, but they really could use more help at the position, especially if they're trying to look for ways to help Haskins develop and more playmaking ability on their team in general, because with just Haskins under center and nobody really of note to throw to, it's going to take him longer to build up as a quarterback. So if they were to find a receiver now who could come in and they could grow together, that could be the best case scenario for Haskins and whoever they end up picking. And that brings us to the final team with the wide receiver need. And they essentially created this hole for themselves, even if people could argue that the need already existed, it is definitely wide out in the open now. And we're talking about the Houston Texans, who did the unthinkable, or should I say more precisely, head coach Bill O'Brien did the unthinkable not too long ago and traded star wideout DeAndre Hopkins and a 4th-round pick to the Arizona Cardinals for running back David Johnson, a 2020 second-round pick, and a 2021 4th-rounder. So while David Johnson can potentially add elite, maybe running back talent to the Texans if he remains healthy, that if is a huge if, because David Johnson hasn't been able to maintain a consistent season in at least 2 years, and he wasn't even functioning in the Arizona offense that he had spent so many years in, and he really has just fallen off as a top-ranked running back in the league in general. So the move, even though that's not what we're considering here, the move really doesn't make sense unless Bill O'Brien is focusing a lot on the wide receivers in this draft. And you could argue that. You could argue that there's a lot of good talent to be had here, and if they want to go younger to pair with their quarterback, Deshaun Watson, they could make that happen. But Houston didn't essentially trade for a first-round pick. So in this draft, they don't have any first-round picks. So whether they're sitting on them and hoping to throw in a huge deal for another team to take, to maybe trade up and get DeAndre Hopkins' replacement, it still is going to be a longer, I should say, road upward for Houston to fill the holes that they need to fill on their team now that they've gotten rid of their number one receiver and probably one of the best, if not the best, wide receiver in the game right now. So, you sign Randall Cobb, that's not going to get the job done. They definitely need a legitimate wide receiver. That's going to be their number one target now that this crater of a need has been created by head coach Bill O'Brien. So it'll be interesting to see what moves they end up making, specifically on draft day, because all of Bill O'Brien's mad trading just got them a lot of draft picks late in the draft this year. Almost half of their picks come in the 7th round. So to be able to leverage that into an immediately plug-and-playable wide receiver, even as deep as this draft is going to be a challenging one for the Houston Texans. But now that is what all of their off-season focus is going to have to go towards. And they haven't left themselves a lot of room for flexibility. But we should at least think that one of their 2 second-round picks will be spent on a receiver to now replace instead of add to and complement DeAndre Hopkins. And that takes us to our next break. But when we come back, we're going to dive into the last wide receiver prospect that we're going to take a deep look at in this episode.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 4 segments, we talked about a couple of players who have gotten a little less attention because of the depth at wide receiver in this draft. and 6 of the teams that are going to be looking specifically to these players to fill their wide receiver needs. And now we're going to cover the last player for this episode that is increasing his draft stock and launching himself up mock draft boards. And that's Denzel Mims out of Baylor. And as far as Denzel Mims goes, there are always players that can help or hurt themselves based off of their performance at the Combine. And last month, no player might have helped himself more than Baylor's wide receiver. And that goes for all of the players that were mentioned in this episode. But Mims was a standout in his own right before the Combine. That's what makes him a little bit different. In the Big 12, he definitely would have been considered a star in that conference. But he just got overshadowed by CeeDee Lamb at Oklahoma, which is completely understandable. But he's still considered a star in his own right. When he even joined CeeDee Lamb on first team All Big 12 honors last season. And he had an astonishing 2019 season, racking up over 1,000 yards with 66 receptions, 12 TDs, all over the span of 14 games. And he was one of the top standouts in the Senior Bowl in January down in Mobile, Alabama. And multiple media outlets that follow sports after that highlighted him as a player that helped his draft stock significantly thanks to all of the showcases. So he was really able to set himself apart and impress at the Senior Bowl, which was an amazing effort in his own right. But once his Combine performance came in, he solidified himself as a bona fide first rounder. He clocks in at 207 pounds and at 6'3", which is pretty ideal for a wide receiver in this day and age. But he ran a 4.38 second 40-yard dash and added a 38.5-inch vertical jump and a 6.66 second 3-cone drill on top of all of that. And not to mention his 20-yard shuttle run came in at 4.43. So each of those numbers that he put up at the Combine puts him in the elite category for wide receivers. And there's no better way that he would have been able to put on display just how much he can do if it wasn't for those performances at the Combine. So luckily for him and most of the receivers that didn't get all of the national attention this year in this draft, thanks to all of the elite receivers stacked at the top of this historical class, he was able to put the league on notice and make scouts pay attention to him. And not just that, but make fans pay attention to him too, especially fans that are outside of the Big 12 and don't usually get to see Baylor games because they're not a national ranked team in the way that they used to be. And a lot of other schools have taken that spotlight. And a lot of other players have taken that spotlight, as we've mentioned. So coming out of the Combine, a lot of people took note of what he'd done, and now he's being looked at as an absolute lock to be in the first round with the combination of his speed and his size. So he has really been able to put himself on the map and really be able to impress everyone who watches him. And it seems like he has the confidence within himself to know that not only he was always capable of this, but he's capable of more. And that's what a lot of teams love to see in prospects, because they want that aggressiveness and that maybe a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, that drive that makes them not only want to stay great, but get better. And it seems like Mims himself had that within him before even the spotlight was on him, because even before the Combine, he has been quoted as saying that he most definitely thinks he belongs in the first round and amongst the top receivers of the draft class. And he added that he's not necessarily paying attention to the naysayers and stuff like that may be going on social media, but he is honest about where he needs to improve, which is another thing you would love to see and you very rarely see. And that does bring the focus a little bit more to his route running ability and the fact that he can do a little bit of a better job when it comes to transitions at the top of his routes and trying to outmaneuver the secondary that's trying to defend him, which he's admitted to himself and has said that he wants to be able to get an elite run out of his routes so that he can get away from the defenders and catch the ball more in an open space and be able to add yards after the catch or even be able to break out because of his speed. So still, all that being said, though, with the combine performance that he put up not too long ago, he's put himself in a position to be one of the most looked at wide receivers in this draft. And he could potentially be one of the players that you'll see make the highest leap from where he's projected to go to where he may actually be picked. So he's definitely an interesting prospect to keep an eye out for, because a lot of the public and public fans aren't going to be focusing in on Mims as an elite wide receiver prospect. And that really just has to do with how deep this class is. Once again, if it was any other year, we'd be talking about Mims going within the top 10 probably at this point. But he is for sure a first-round pick. He's earned his way to that position. And it'll be really fun to see which teams are the most interested, even though he doesn't run the most diverse route tree in the world. And he can sometimes use a little more nuance when he is trying to outthink defenders. But that being said, too, his body mobility and his skill to snap off in certain breaks and certain directions is way more than you would expect for a receiver his size. And because of his size, his best skill usually comes on fade passes and vertical routes, where he can usually go one-on-one with a receiver, and in those instances, he might be able to break out and win, and those are usually favorable to him, which is why for a quarterback to really reach him, they probably have to throw more to his back shoulders, and that's really where he excels, because of how physically he plays. But luckily for whatever team takes him, he also has great body control. It's definitely on the higher end of receivers that they've seen this year. And he has a really good catch radius because, again, of his size and speed. And that is one aspect that translates very well from college to the NFL, especially in this day's game, because you're going to have to see a lot of that to be able to break out from defenders and get scores or even just get downfield. With the quality of talent raising across the board. So he projects as a potential starter when he enters the pros, which is a really good sign for him. But he does still need to develop on his routes and effective play-side blocking, which may help him find more reps early in his pro career as he gets eased more into it and looks to add more refinement and more skill and more ability to his game. So, with Mims coming off of career season at Baylor and being one of these year's top prospects, even in this deep wide receiving class, Mims appears to have all the forces working in his favor, and the arrow on his career trajectory is definitely facing up as he attempts to transition into the NFL. So for right now, there's nothing but optimism in Mims' future, and depending on what team takes him, we could be hearing his name for a long time down the road. And that brings us to our last break, but when we come back, we're going to take a look at the best of the rest. Because this is such a deep wide receiver class, there is no way that we could get to all of the players that are notable on the board and we could hear their name called. So we're going to take a look at the top 10 honorable mention wide receivers.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
And welcome back to the College Football Podcast. Now, in the first 5 segments, we talked about a few of the wide receiver prospects that are getting a lot of attention, although not as much as they should be, and a lot of the teams that are going to be paying a lot of attention to wide receivers that they might pick in this year's draft. Now, because there are so many wide receivers in the draft this year, and it's a historically deep class, there's no way that we can touch on every single wide receiver that deserves to be named. So for the final segment, we're going to take a look at 10 wide receivers that definitely deserve an honorable mention. So the first wide receiver is Jalen Reagor out of Texas Christian University. And in the past year, he accumulated over 600 receiving yards off of 43 catches and added in 5 TDs in 12 games while piling on 89 more yards on the ground and 15 punt returns for 312 total yards and 2 return touchdowns. On top of that, he contributed 5 kick returns for 72 total yards. So over his 3 years with TCU, he hauled in 22 touchdowns through the air, but also made a name for himself as one of the most dangerous punt returners in the country, as you can tell by his stats. So he was tied for the national lead with a pair of punt return scores, but also ranked second in the country by averaging over 20 yards per punt return. But just to put icing on the cake, he also set a TCU single-season record in punt returns. So Jalen Reagor definitely has a diverse skill set, is another receiver to watch. Next up is KJ Hamler out of Penn State, and last season he fell just short of 1,000 yards, coming in at 904 off of 56 receptions with 8 touchdowns and 13 rushes for 43 yards over 13 games. So he was another special teamer who contributed 23 punt returns for 126 yards and 24 kick returns for 513 yards, which averaged more than 21 yards per return. So that is a pretty solid effort at that position. And at the combine, he didn't run the 40-yard dash, but he's known for being speedy and being quick on the field, and profiles mostly as a slot receiver at the next level, mostly because of his smaller stature and size, and because he has the ability to be used as a returner. So oddly enough, even though he's only coming in at 5'9" on the measurement chart, he was mostly used at Penn State as a third down guy, and they trusted him a lot on third downs, and he consistently was able to put up catches in situations that they needed him the most. So his speed can be seen as comparable to that of Mecole Hardman of the Kansas City Chiefs, but he also runs really good routes, and he has the speed to break open at any moment, like a lot of receivers in this draft. But on top of that, he can also do kick and punt returns. So a guy like KJ Hamler could be one of those later draft picks who can come in to the NFL and end up making a bigger impact than expected on the field. And next up is Michael Pittman Jr. out of University of Southern California. And last year he topped 1,200 yards through 13 games on the season, and caught just over 100 balls and added in 11 touchdowns. So he definitely put up a solid performance, and he has the pedigree to go with it, because his father, Michael Sr., was also an NFLer and played 11 seasons across Arizona, Tampa Bay, and Denver. So like father, like son in this situation, and his son, Michael Jr., was a standout at USC, and it turned out a stellar senior season, even though the Pac-12 doesn't get nearly as much national attention as the other Power 5 conferences. But Pittman Jr. recorded more receiving yards and touchdown catches in his final season than he did in his first 3 seasons at USC combined. So he's definitely hitting his stride at the right time, and he's looking to follow in his father's footsteps. That brings us to KJ Hill out of Ohio State. And Hill rarely, if ever, saw pass coverages. So that's one area of concern that teams have for him at Ohio State. So it could take him time to learn the nuances of combating a tight man coverage with secondary players, and especially at the line of scrimmage. It might take a little bit of a adjusting period and some growing pains for KJ Hill to be able to effectively transition his game to the pro level. But he certainly knows how to lose corners with his head fakes, his shoulder fakes, and he has lightning quick feet. So there is potential for him to become an NFL mainstay. That brings us to Notre Dame wide receiver Chase Claypool. And he seemed to not have a lot of national attention compared to a lot of the other wide receivers, obviously. But that all changed after his performance at the Combine as well. And the former Irish wide receiver turned heads simply just by receiving his final measurements from the Combine. And that's due to the fact that he put on an additional 10 pounds of straight muscle just between the Senior Bowl and the Combine, which is only a span of a month. And a lot of people question his speed and had a few doubts about him in varying areas. But once he put up an official time of 4.42 seconds in the 40, he quickly put a lot of the doubts to rest, and a lot of them have quieted since his Combine performance. And in doing so, setting that time at the Combine, he became only the second wide receiver to come in at least at 6'4" and 235 and run a sub 4.45 second time since 2003. And the only other wide receiver to accomplish that stat in that amount of time, and in no way is this putting Chase Claypool on that level, but the only other comparable wide receiver to that stat is Calvin Johnson. So if that isn't impressive in itself, he was labeled as a player that's likely going to see a significant climb up draft boards as a result of the dominance that he put up in the exhibitions alone. Not to mention a lot of what he did at Notre Dame didn't really get seen by the national crowd, especially since Notre Dame hasn't been a nationally recognized team in a few years recently. But that has not really affected where Claypool is now expected to go, since he is now expected to be a lock for the first or early second round in the draft. But because of just how deep this draft is, not just at wide receiver, but at other positions like quarterback, tackle, and linebacker, and based off of team needs, he might be one player you see sliding a little further down, just because of those initial doubts coming back into play than you otherwise would see him go. So here's hoping that he is able to capitalize on the additional stock that he added to his player profile in this offseason. Next up is Donovan Peoples-Jones out of Michigan, and he's another intriguing player because just like Chase Claypool, he played at a big-name school but didn't necessarily get a lot of attention. And even though he has a wonderful blend of size, skills when it comes to being able to catch, and pure athleticism, he's had a little bit of a problem at quarterback during his time at Michigan, and it's been a little bit of an erratic play at that position. So that really hindered him a little bit, but it also helped him because he was able to show off his ability to make adjustments to our off-target throws and snatch every ball that came his way inside of like his very secure frame. So even though he possibly could have had an even more impressive time in college, he is still able to make a name for himself as being that type of adaptable wide receiver that a lot of teams are going to be looking for. And his skill set can easily be transformed to fit a certain offense, depending on what team picks him. Because he has the ability to scoop out a low throw, but also work back across and change momentum, the direction of his momentum, and be able to pluck the football no matter where it's thrown. So that natural ball tracking skill will definitely come in handy at the next level. And the outstanding body control and balance that comes with it just will help out so much in contested situations. And it really helps in him hang on through bodily contact with other players. So what that comes out to is him doing a great job of extending throwing windows and extending his catch radius, which is so exciting to watch. But he is really fluid in all of that through his movements, and he is able to accelerate easily, decelerate easily, and really hit his stride and be able to glide down the field when need be. If they were to pick out a little bit of a negative about Peoples-Jones, it would be that he lacks a little bit of a dynamic twitch and quickness in short area plays, and he frequently got reps from the slot. So that provided him a lot of the free releases that he needed in order to really develop his ability to deal with clear press coverages and really just prove that he is able to be a player that can get to any part of the field and end up making the play. So his vertical cuts and being able to seamlessly get down the field, creating yardage after the catch for himself, his ability to see the field well and break tackles, and ultimately, above all, compete as an alpha, which is what's going to really put him over the top with scouts and teams, really makes him a prime candidate to ascend to the next level and really hit his peak if he has the right pro coaching staff surrounding him. So as spectacular as he may have looked at times at Michigan, this might just be the beginning of what we're seeing from Donovan Peoples-Jones. Next up is Bryan Edwards out of South Carolina, and Edwards is bound to fall a little bit in the draft, and that is not necessarily a commentary on his skill, but it more likely has to do with injuries because he has a pretty recent one after breaking his foot earlier on in the pre-draft process. So even though he comes in as a very good-sized receiver at 6'3" and 215 pounds, there is a little bit of a worry surrounding him. But to reassure teams, he did produce 4 consecutive seasons at South Carolina where he showed off his crafty footwork and impressive hands and was also able to beat press coverage at the line of scrimmage, which he saw a lot of in the SEC. So he has the credibility behind him. He has the skill set. The biggest question now is going to be his injury history and whether or not he'll be able to overcome that in his pro career. And that brings us to Tyler Johnson of Minnesota. And he was a star at the Big Ten school who can be utilized anywhere, especially because of his handiwork at the line of scrimmage and his running back-like style where he can accumulate yards after the catch. And that'll be really effective in the NFL. And those attributes are going to be a little more important. And that's lucky for him because he is somewhat lacking in long-term speed, which is where he falls behind a lot of the other receivers in this class and falls out of a lot of what most teams are looking for in today's football. But he definitely shows the potential to put up NFL-level production. And next on our honorable mentions list is Darnell Mooney out of Tulane. And coming in at 5'10" and 176 pounds, he's on the smaller side when it comes to receivers. But that's where his expertise comes in because he is a rocket, essentially, and ran a 4.38 40-yard dash at the combine. but he also plays to that speed on the field, which is what's rare to see between real-life speed and combine speed. Those environments are very different, so the fact that he's able to replicate it at an exhibition like the NFL Combine shows that that speed is real. And even though he was more of a possession wideout for Tulane last season and averaged a little less per catch than the season before, he went from averaging about 20 yards per catch to just under 15 yards per catch last season. But his burst off of the line of scrimmage at the snap and his ability to kick himself into second gear are both phenomenal traits for any NFL team to have. So he's definitely going to be on the radar. And last but certainly not least is Joe Reed out of Virginia. And this is another feature back body wide receiver coming in at 6 foot even, but 224 pounds. And he has the surprising ability to effortlessly glide on the field and break out of arm tackle attempts and bust out of short area situations, kind of like a running back in this situation. And that makes him really unique, but interesting to look at the next level too, because he has the potential to have one of the smoother transitions from the college game to the NFL. He has multiple uses. His speed in the combine came in after 4.50 in the 40-yard dash, and that's impressive for wide receivers, but his speed on the field doesn't necessarily play that fast. So where his expertise is going to come in and where he's going to set himself apart is by focusing on yards after the catch that he can get, and mostly that comes in the way of making defenders miss or just absorbing the hit and being able to continue trucking forward instead of just being the kind of receiver that needs to have a home run ball thrown down the field for him to break out and go get. So in this sense, he's a little bit more comparable to Deebo Samuel from the 49ers and the role that he plays for them, which really just makes him ready-made for the modern-day NFL, the direction that's going in, and a super fun sleeper prospect for teams to work with and keep their eyes on. So while Joe Reed had a bit of an overlooked season at a school like Virginia, he has the ability to really be a sleeper breakout wide receiver in this very stacked draft class. And we may not see gems like the ones that we have in this draft class for a long time to come. Thanks for listening to the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you remember to subscribe to the show and write a nice review. That really helps us. Also, please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network, from football to basketball, baseball to MMA, and even soccer. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts College Football Podcast.